welcome back. I'm Dr. Trish Leigh, and we're here for lesson 2 on really understanding porn and sex addiction. Let's get started right away. Okay, what you're going to learn in lesson 2 is how it begins, why it happens, the underlying causes, what is actually happening in the mind of the sex addict, the sex addiction cycle, what it looks like and why it perpetuates, what happens in the brain of a sex addict, how and why sex addiction happens in the first place and then escalates, and why you didn't know before, or maybe you did and didn't want to. So we're going to discuss that and pick it apart. Let's do it. So how sex addiction begins usually. So usually it's exposure at a very young age. And in this course, we're really talking more about pornography addiction. So pornography tends to be the easiest exposure to sexual characteristics and behaviors, and a lot of them can be seen either in print like it was back in the day, and now in the digital age it's just easier than ever. And in young men under the age of 25, pornography addiction is off the charts. So this is a very, very important aspect, but not everybody is susceptible. It's nature and nurture. So how it usually begins is there's a familial predisposition to addictive behaviors, and then there's exposure at a young age. That is nature, and then nurture. More aspects of the nurture part is that there's a very stressful family situation that might lack intimacy, or there may be trauma, and that can be big trauma or just low-grade trauma that's consistent. And people ask me all the time in my office at Leigh Brain and Spine, what is trauma? And you know, the definitions of trauma have very similar attributes to them, but it can be different for every single person in terms of what is traumatic on a person's nervous system. So even being in a chaotic household that you don't feel like anybody in it is supporting you can be traumatic over the course of 16 years of development. So lack of intimacy and trauma are at the root of pornography and sex addiction. So what happens is those addictive behaviors become used as a coping mechanism for difficult feelings. Sometimes it's boredom on how to stimulate one's own nervous system when you're bored. And there's a relationship to ADHD in terms of pornography addiction, because what happens is that nervous system, there's a bug. That nervous system needs self-stimulation. What happens more often is stress and anxiety sets in, and there's anxious behaviors or anxious attachment or anxiety in the home, and porn and sex addiction are used as coping mechanisms to self-soothe the nervous system from stress and anxiety. So we're going to look at that, but typically this is how it usually begins. So if you talk to your husband or your partner and they tell you that they've basically always watched porn and they've been watching it since they were a teenager and that it's just a hobby, that idea that they started watching it in their teenage years, especially if you know that they have intimacy issues and a possibly traumatic or chaotic household, this is a sign to look for in terms of addiction over just a hobby or habit. Okay, so why it happens, the underlying causes of sex addiction. Like I just told you, it's nature and nurture. So there's a familial propensity. You'll see in the literature if you look, which you probably will, knowing many women who are in the same position as you, reading and learning is something that they will do a lot of. And really an important reason why I am here is because I want you to learn the actual facts and the science behind this instead of just trolling the internet and becoming confused by information that contradicts each other. But what I was going to say is you'll see online that it's called genetic a lot, and it is genetic. It can be genetic. From my standpoint of looking at brain patterns and neurological function, what we know from the science and how brains operate is that brains don't fall far from the tree, as I always tell people. So your husband's brain pattern will be very similar to his parents, one or both of them. Same thing goes for you. And that's the nature part, is that our brain patterns are very similar to our parents. So that's why we look at familial history when we're trying to help people, because if there's addictive behaviors in that person's family of origin and the lineage before them, that puts them at risk. So there's a familial propensity is what I call it, but you can call it a genetic factor that makes it so that it's a brain that leads towards addiction. Okay, so then what happens is the nurture aspect is that there's childhood trauma or stressors, very stressful family situation, again, feeling like there might not be somebody who they can depend on, intimacy issues, so not building proper attachment with a parent, need for escapism from their reality, and again, early exposure makes it so that those issues then get attached to sexual behaviors. Okay, so what is actually happening in the mind of a sex addict, especially when they are becoming caught up in the addictive cycle, which we will talk about next. So first and foremost, there's underlying anxiety there basically all the time. And as we get to what you can do about this, I'll share with you about QEEG brain mapping, which is something that we offer at Leigh Brain and Spine, but that you can find across the world. So what we see in spouses of sex addicts and in sex addicts themselves, spouses is presumably developed because of their situation, but especially in addicts, there is a brain pattern for anxiety. Honestly, there's an actual brain pattern for addiction and sexual addiction in particular. So we look for that pattern when we're helping people. But my point is that anxiety is there all the time. The addictive behaviors are used to offset the anxiety. So you might not even consider the person to be an anxious person, especially if they've been in this addictive cycle for a long time, because they've been offsetting that anxiety for a really long time. But you can see it in their brain pattern, which doesn't lie. It's scientific. But for now, let's just take it at that. Anxiety is there. And then in moments of more anxiety is triggered even more. So the difference is, in a person who doesn't suffer from the anxiety brain pattern, their baseline might be here in terms of their starting point for anxiety. And then if they're triggered, they go up to here. What happens in people with sexual addiction is their baseline's up here, and when they're triggered, it goes to here, which creates uncomfortable levels of addiction, which is what starts the cycle in the first place. But what happens in the mind of the sex addict is then there's objectification of women, if we're talking about your husband, and fantasy to escape reality. So what that might look like in a very simple sense is your husband looks at a lot of other women and just looks at their bodies. He's not actually seeing them as people. He's seeing them as objects, kind of objects to conquer that will make his nervous system feel better. And it's soothing his nervous system by objectification of women, looking at women as objects. Then it leads to fantasy. There's a lot of fantasy thoughts, and those thoughts take that person out of their real world. Even if they're just standing in a restaurant, they begin to fantasize, which takes them out of the real world and soothes the nervous system. And remember, this is a brain pattern. It's not a choice. So then there's mostly self-soothing. It can be self-stimulation, actually simultaneously, but usually let's just call it soothing of the nervous system. What leads to porn watching is there's a trigger that is stressful, and then usually there's other addictive behaviors that are included, like use of alcohol or drugs, video games. What happens then is inhibitions are down, and your husband, the person, will then set to task to soothe the nervous system using porn as hardcore objectification of women. So when someone's watching porn on a screen, it's all fantasy. None of that is actually real. And especially in today's day and age, where there's some really graphic porn of all different kinds that are accessible at your fingertips, that can really put a man into a world of fantasy to take them out of the world of their work and their wife and their children and their finances. All of that just falls away and the person becomes numb. Numb is a word that we'll use in the business, and will feel better for a time. Then what happens is after they've watched porn or masturbated, they will feel worse. Shame sets in. And when shame sets in, it makes them feel even more anxious, and the cycle continues. And the underlying need continues. And I'm going to show you the cycle. I'm going to show you the brain mechanism so you understand that. So let's get going. So the addiction cycle, how it begins, it peaks, and it continues is there's a trigger. So it can be a stressful event, or it can just be part of that person's daily life. So for example, for some men, when they check their bank account, that leads to a trigger of being stressed out about finances. They're on the computer, which just leads them to click right over to a porn site to soothe the stress that they feel surrounding finances. And then what happens is the idea of there's already a fantasy going about what it's going to be like when they get on that porn site. So it's fantasy and preoccupation. It's called in the literature the hijacked brain. Patrick Carnes, who's one of the founding fathers in the area of sex addiction, calls it a hijacked brain, and I concur wholeheartedly. Then what happens is there's ritualization. So especially as this becomes a long repeated habit, there'll be certain times in a person's day or life where they will set themselves up to watch porn. And in the setting up, there's a huge dump of pleasure juice in the brain, and that really gets the juices flowing. That ritualization is actually part of the appeal and is the part of the process that is the best for the sex or porn addict. Then it leads to the acting out phase, which is actually watching porn and masturbating to it, which then in the acting out phase, that feels great to them too. But in the culmination of the acting out phase, there's a major letdown. So once your husband or the man has reached orgasm and that time is over, there is a major letdown and a time of despair. And that despair can be another trigger, believe it or not. That's why it becomes a self-punishing cycle, because step number 5 leads to step number 6, repeat. And so then this cycle just continues over and over and over. It can happen on a daily basis. It can happen 10 times a day. It can happen on a weekly basis. It can happen on a monthly basis. Usually it's more than that, but the idea is that this occurs in this cycle, and it continues and it perpetuates and it gets worse. So how and why sex addiction happens and then escalates. This is the brain-based model of the brain mechanisms. There's 3 stages that occur. And what happens is in the initial stage, it creates what's called a positive feedback loop, which then leads to a negative feedback loop, which needs to be avoided. And I'm going to show you that. So basically what a positive feedback loop looks like is the behavior leads to great feelings and pleasure and release from stress. But like we talked about in the despair part, then what happens is not doing it, not watching porn, leaves the person in that mode of despair. So now it's not even that they are watching porn to feel good, it's they're watching porn to not feel bad. So hopefully you understand that distinction. And that switch is when it becomes an impulsive behavior. I think I'm going to do this, to a compulsive behavior. I need to do this again so I can try to make those bad feelings go away. And when it switches from impulsive to compulsive, that's when we have full-blown addiction happening and then escalating in these 3 stages. So let's look at them. Binge and intoxication is number 1. Stage number 2 is withdrawal and negative effect. Stage number 3 is preoccupation and anticipation. So what happens in stage number 1, binge intoxication, is this is what happens in the brain. So when a person begins to watch porn, dopamine, which is the pleasure brain juice, just to think about it in an easy concept, is dumped into the reward center of the brain from the frontal lobe. So the prefrontal cortex, which is up here, and the frontal lobe, I'm going to show you a picture in just a minute. The frontal lobe is implicated in porn and sex addiction. It's what's causing it. And in the brain patterns that I see on QEEG brain mapping, this is there in just about every single person who has a porn or sex addiction. It's actually this area in the middle most times. It's called the anterior cingulate gyrus. It's on fire with anxiety and the need for stimulation, both of them typically. So what happens is, as this frontal lobe is firing and is getting all stimulated and soothed, it dumps the pleasure juice dopamine into the reward center in the midbrain. Again, I'll show you a picture in just a second, but it gives the person a high. So it's like having a drink or using drugs for the first time. In this first positive phase, the brain is learning that when I watch porn, I feel really good. So tons of dopamine is going to really make that person feel elated. So what happens is those neuroplastic changes begin to happen. I always tell people that neuroplasticity can be our best friend if we're doing all the right things to wire our brain in. It can be our worst enemy if we're doing all the wrong things, or one thing that's really seriously dysregulated, like porn and sex addiction. So what happens is, the more you put yourself into this cycle of binge and intoxication over some time, it creates a tolerance, a need for more, and a need for more graphic porn. And so then the reward center's literally changing. And if you think about, again, tolerance when it comes to alcoholism, which most people know about, is that after you drink 2 drinks and 2 drinks and 2 drinks, now you need 3 or 4 drinks to be able to get the same level of intoxication, because the brain has gotten used to the feeling of 2 drinks. It's the same thing here. The brain is literally changing, and it needs more stimulation and more soothing to achieve the same high. And we're going to see what it looks like, but what it does is it creates tolerance and it leads to the next stage. And here is what the hijack brain looks like. That lit up area is the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe, which leads to the midbrain reward center. I'll show you that in a slide or two. Stage number 2 is withdrawal and negative effect. So when the person's done watching porn, that dopamine rush runs its course and it's over with. So the high ends. And so in this stage, there's withdrawal. And this is a really important part for me to communicate to you, is that what happens is the amygdala, which is the area of the brain it's in the limbic center in the middle of the brain. Again, I'll show it to you in just a second, but that area is associated with pain processing and fear. So this is a very dysregulated anti-stress system. So what happens is, through this withdrawal phase, the person can no longer cope with regular stressors in life because their stress system is off kilter. So not only do they need more and more dopamine dumped into their brain to feel okay, just regular life feels harder than it should because their anti-stress system is not working. Things that shouldn't be stressful are massively stressful. Hopefully you understand that. So it activates the brain's stress system and it deactivates the anti-stress system. So you can understand during this withdrawal and negative effect part of the cycle how the need to get back to porn is it's such a driving force, because the brain is so dysregulated. It needs more dopamine to offset this intense feelings of fear and pain and stress without the brain anti-stressing for it. Okay, hopefully you're with me on that. So what this ultimately looks like is changes in the reward mechanism in the brain. It's a decreased sensitivity to the reward in the first place, an increased reward threshold, which is called tolerance. But really the most important part that I want to communicate to you is that this is nothing that has to do with you. It's been there since childhood. It's been hardwiring itself in since then. And when you notice it, it has hit a tipping point that is begging for you to break this stage in the process, because it leads to stage 3, which is probably something you're already going through. And I'm going to show you in just a second. First, let's look at a picture of the prefrontal cortex and how it relates to the amygdala. So you can see right here in the front where it's lit up pink and red, this is the prefrontal cortex. So metacognition, or thinking about thinking, happens up here. Higher reasoning, executive function. So things like empathy and insight, flexibility, emotional regulation, body regulation, morality, intuition, attuned communication, and fear modulation are up here in the prefrontal cortex. So again, my message to you is, if your husband can't stop, can't communicate it to you, can't regulate himself emotionally, doesn't understand what you're going through, that is his hijacked brain. That is not necessarily him. But the reality might be that his brain's been hijacked since his teens. So it becomes very shocking for people in your standpoint and in your place. But it's important that you understand this is happening in your husband's brain right now, and this cycle needs to be broken. So what it leads to is, in the limbic brain, there's fight, flight, or freeze. That's a major stress response where the person's, am I safe? Do people want me? There's real strong self-esteem issues at the bottom of porn and sex addiction, and emotions live there. And I already told you how the amygdala becomes dysregulated. It's massively stressed out, and it's not able to de-stress itself in a healthy way like a healthy brain would. And this is how it goes together in this image of the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So hopefully you're with me. It's in the brain. If you have no other takeaway, it's the brain that has learned to continue to perpetuate this cycle. It's the brain that is doing it, right? Hashtag control your brain or it will control you. This is a situation where the brain is controlling the person. So in stage 2, the important points are that withdrawal is different than in substance abuse addictions, but it's just as real. So I need you to know this too, that we've already talked about. It's in a shift from impulsive to compulsive behavior. So not just, hey, I think I'm going to watch porn today because it's fun and I'm going to watch it for a half hour, to this underlying need to avoid the feelings of pain and get a little rush of dopamine, a little feeling of pleasure for just a minute, but it's mostly to avoid the pain of all the other time at this point. And withdrawal leads to the need to watch more and more porn that's more graphic. And interestingly enough, studies show that this actually decreases executive function. All those things that were listed in the last slide, those abilities are derailed. So those things begin to fall away. And so that's why your husband literally cannot perform those skills well. It's a hijacked brain. And if they're not watching porn, the adverse emotions kick in: anxiety, depression, anger, irritability, and something called dysphoria, which is just a dissatisfaction with life. So those things were there in the beginning, and this porn and sex addiction cycle has been used to soothe them out of these feelings. So when withdrawal sets in, those are the feelings they have, which brings them back to stage 3, preoccupation and anticipation, cravings. There's cravings to do it again. And in this craving stage, it impairs function in the prefrontal cortex. So if we were going to put that into a couple small categories based on that list, it's motivation, self-regulation and self-control, delayed reward discounting. So they need the reward right away. They cannot delay the need for that reward. Executive function skills, which we just looked at, those higher level reasoning skills, cognitive skills, which are thinking skills. And what it does is it leaves your husband very vulnerable for a reinstatement of the behavior due to stress, due to the cues or the triggers, which then causes relapse. So that is what makes it so that when a person tries to quit, they're not able to do so, because this cycle is hardcore in play. So what that looks like in real life playing out of these brain mechanisms is that a person will use porn to de-stress and get rid of anxiety, numb out, avoid boredom, avoid engagement in the world, and it builds tolerance and it desensitizes the person, so they have a need for more and more and more stimulation. And when they are in the withdrawal periods, when they're not getting it, they become moody, angry, and impulsive. So look for that and how it plays out in real world. Okay, How can the brain be changed? I just told you, neuroplasticity can be your best friend if you're doing all the right things. And in this short course, I'm going to show you that there's 2 ways that we can rewire a brain from bottom up and top down. And doing both of them together will affect the quickest change for your husband and for you. Top down is directly at the brain performance pattern. So I've just told you that there's an EEG pattern that's associated with sexual and porn addiction. And that pattern can be changed. It can be changed using something called neurofeedback therapy. And what happens is neurofeedback teaches the brain to use a healthier pattern to be able to break that negative feedback loop that is in place and to begin to establish a positive feedback loop. I wish I could tell you that neurofeedback would work by itself for you and for your husband, because honestly, it works for people with ADHD and with some other lower grade issues. Unfortunately, it is not the end all and be all in your situation. You will also need a very intense bottom up solution to your issue. And what that means is you're also going to use your husband's and yours, your minds and your bodies to rewire your brain. So when we change our thoughts and our behaviors, it will wire in new thoughts, new behaviors, new habits, a new way of engaging with the world. And in this particular situation, both of them are needed. We need a top-down approach to address the brain at the brain's level right away. And we also need right away that bottom-up approach to break the behaviors that are causing the cycle. That's going to be a little painful, which is why neurofeedback will help that pain for him and for you. And then rewire the brain both ways. So the brain can actually change. It takes time and training. Unfortunately, this process has been found to take time. And that's different for everybody, but it's not short. It's a process, not an event. We have to change the negative feedback loop to a positive feedback loop, and that will take time. Think at least a year, possibly 2 or 3 or more. So what does that training look like? At the level of the brain is neurofeedback therapy. I'm going to show you what that looks like. At the level of the mind and body, you need to find yourself a certified sex addiction therapist. That is not just a sex therapist, it's a sex addiction therapist, a CSAT, CSAT. That will be the game changer and will make all the difference in recovery. Then there's porn addiction coaches, those people who have moved through this process themselves and who have been successful, who can give you support all along the way. There's support groups, and definitely your husband needs an accountability partner that is not you, so that they can learn from their relapses and mistakes without all the emotions that will go along with it for you. And that is top-down and bottom-up approach to affect change in the best way possible. Time and training it takes. Okay, so why didn't you know before? Well, maybe your intuition, your spider senses weren't tingling because, first of all, knowledge is power. You might not have had any idea. You couldn't see it because you were in it. You know how that goes. You can't see it until there's a tipping point. And secondly, you might have thought it was a little bit of an issue. And, I work with a lot of women that are in this situation. And in hindsight, they see how all of the small things that they went through actually were huge warning signs. But back then, the magnitude wasn't there, the impact wasn't there, and they just didn't understand the consequences and how this cycle is self-perpetuating and will get worse over time. So little red flags were definitely there, but they didn't realize that little red flags can take the ship down. So there wasn't enough knowledge to create urgency. Again, that people who have sex and porn addiction have a lot of secretive behaviors, and a double life, in air quotes, and compartmentalization, really good at just putting it in that compartment and having, sometimes it's porn addiction, sometimes it's much bigger sexual behaviors, but they can turn that off when they come home and be a family man. It's not integrated like it would be for most of us because of the brain mechanisms. So I know a lot of women in your position are just really mad at their spouse, and that's okay. But part of why I'm here is to build empathy for him, because it's a real problem for him too. He would never actually choose that if he had the ability not to. again, the shame cycle, there's non-disclosure. So you know how it goes. If something bad happens to you, and honestly, you're in it right now probably, which is why you need to follow the steps and tell someone immediately, is that non-disclosure leads to feelings of dishonesty and then lying or covering up in what are otherwise honest men. So many times men are completely honest about everything else in their relationship with you, but this is just so shameful that they cannot tell you about it. And what I mean by you might be going through this right now yourself is this whole situation is probably creating shame for you and you don't feel like you can tell anybody. And I will tell you, there's a lot of misunderstanding about this in the general population, which means your friends and family, which is why you need to find a trusted friend. If you can't find a trusted friend, just get yourself a coach and definitely get yourself a CSAT so that you have someone to talk to. The minute you talk about it, it becomes real. You need to make this real so you can have the strength to move forward. And so that you don't get yourself into a shame cycle because you feel like you have to cover it up and not tell anybody, especially since it's not your issue. It's, you know, you're on the sidelines and it's becoming your issue. Why you didn't know before is gaslighting. So gaslighting is crazy making. It comes from a movie. In 1938, a movie came out where a husband makes his wife think she's crazy. And since then, the term gaslighting or crazy making has taken over in this type of literature. And it can be purposeful or accidental. And many times it's accidental in that it goes back to the shame cycle where your husband doesn't want to tell you. So he accidentally uses all these techniques to make you throw you off his trail. And we're going to talk about that. And most times there's such low self-awareness in husbands that they just don't understand what is happening. They know what they're doing. They convince themselves, which is part of it, denial. They convince themselves it's not that big of a deal. And because they are in it even closer than you are, they cannot see it at all, which is why you need the strength to move forward to make them see it. You'll need the strength for the two of you. Okay, what's up next? 2 phases, before and after discovery, why you feel hurt. We'll talk about spousal attachment and relational trauma and the roller coaster. This has probably already been a roller coaster for you. And if it hasn't, buckle up because this will become a roller coaster ride, sister. And it's okay. And why it's okay that it's a roller coaster ride, so you can understand that. So stay tuned. Meet me in lesson 3 so we can keep moving forward. Thanks.